3 very scary stories about forest hiking and camping. My companion and I have always taken great pleasure in frequent weekend camping excursions. Having formerly resided in Virginia, we naturally sought out new locations within or in the vicinity of the Appalachian Mountains. We both had quite hectic work schedules during the week, so spending the weekends away from home and immersed in nature was incredibly beneficial. We had already completed dozens of camping excursions in the Appalachian Mountains prior to this incident. However, none of them had concluded in such a manner. We chose a narrow 3-mile trail on a Saturday morning, which leads to a pleasant, secluded campsite in a gentler section of the mountain. We had not previously visited the particular location. However, based on the substantial number of Google reviews, we inferred that the trail was relatively well known among campers. We prepared our belongings, loaded the truck with camping supplies, and proceeded to the campsite. Although it was only a 45-minute drive from our residence, it began to rain heavily as we approached. This was fairly typical in this mountainous region, so the rain did not significantly disturb us because we were accustomed to being outside in it. We approached the trailhead, which was in fact a mere diversion from the roadside, and observed an additional vehicle parked there. We had anticipated a greater number of individuals in light of the trail's notoriety, but were relieved that it was not overly congested. However, as we began to gather our belongings, my fiancé informed me that the passenger door of the parked car was only slightly ajar. We both searched for the owner, but since we did not observe them in the area, I went over and forcibly closed the door, concluding that the owner had left it open by error. Even though the entire passenger seat was already drenched from the rain, at least the situation would not worsen. After returning to our vehicle to retrieve my belongings, we both commenced our descent of the trail. We discussed how peculiar it was that the door was ajar, and how the lack of a lock on the vehicle would likely alert the majority of individuals to the situation. Additionally, it is noteworthy to mention that the vehicle in question was undeniably a relatively costly model from the recent past, which further compounded its peculiar nature. At any case, the rain began to intensify at this juncture, prompting us to accelerate our pace of travel in order to reach the campsite in time to pitch our tents. We arrived at the destination in approximately 2 hours due to the predominantly ascending terrain. Upon our arrival, our immediate observation was a tent that had already been erected in the center of the level expanse. It was quite compact, certainly suitable for a single individual. We hypothesized that they were likely seeking sanctuary from the rain in that area, so we pitched our tent in a remote corner of the site. We ate some food we brought inside and laid out some of our belongings to dry for an hour before hearing voices outside. They were speaking too loudly due to the rain that was striking the tent, so I unzipped the front and peered outside. I was momentarily startled to see 2 men kneeling and staring at us from within 2 feet, but they soon stood up, introduced themselves, and smiled. They reported that they had been in the tent situated in the center of the area for several days. I promptly introduced myself and my fiancée, clarifying that our visit was only temporary in nature. As they retreated, I zipped our tent shut and regarded my companion. The entire exchange appeared slightly atypical, and their behavior appeared to be a little peculiar as well. It came to my attention that both of the men were dressed in form-fitting denim and standard t-shirts, and their tent was far too small to accommodate 2 adult men. It appeared that they were not in the area for camping or hiking, and certainly not for a few days as they had claimed. We chose to leave a portion of the zipper exposed in order to maintain vigilance over them as a precaution. Another hour passed, with nothing peculiar being observed. In actuality, we observed nothing whatsoever. It appears that they were confined to their tent the entire time. Regardless, it had become quite dark outside, so we made the decision to retire for the evening and prepare our sleeping bags. Re-zipping the tent, I reclined in a position adjacent to my companion. However, I must have fallen unconscious quite quickly because I had no recollection of anything after lying down. However, I awoke several hours into the night with the urgent need to use the restroom. As the precipitation persisted, I donned one of my inexpensive plastic rain ponchos to prevent myself from returning to bed drenched. I subsequently departed from our tent and positioned myself a few feet behind a tree. Although it was raining, I could still hear voices. However, their origin was exceedingly difficult to discern. As I began to feel apprehensive, I turned my head in every direction, but failed to meet any individuals. Upon further inspection of the small tent situated in the center, I observed that the front zipper was ajar. Despite the darkness and precipitation that hindered visibility, I was reasonably certain that no one was inside. Having previously been informed by the men that they would be spending the night in the tent, this development heightened my concern even further. I hurriedly approached my tent, whereupon I roused my companion and detailed the situation to her. I could tell that despite her obvious exhaustion, she was equally as anxious as I was. We were both listening in on the conversation when we both detected voices emanating from behind our tent. Despite not knowing what to do, I realized that sitting in the tent no longer felt particularly secure. I instructed my companion to expeditiously gather their belongings and be prepared to depart in the event that the need arose. I then hastily exited the building, retrieved a small pocket knife, and surveyed the trees. I observed the two males from earlier standing within a short distance of our tent. I vividly recall this moment because both of the males were staring at me with complete emotionlessness. There was not a single facial expression or movement exhibited by them. I immediately recognized that these individuals were conspiring to commit a heinous act. They were completely unafraid of me. My girlfriend's glance from outside the tent, which occurred a split second later, roused me from my state of disbelief. I shouted at her to leave while indicating the path back down the mountain. I pursued her while abandoning my bag within the tent. As we approached the periphery of the campsite, I glanced in that direction and saw the two males still standing there. They made no attempt to pursue us. Instead, they merely observed us fleeing in complete terror. We were essentially sprinting for 10 minutes before decelerating and walking rapidly for the remaining distance. Upon returning to our vehicle, we observed that the other parked vehicle was still there, albeit with the passenger door once more ajar. I hurriedly transported us to the closest gas station, where we reported the incident to the authorities. A short while later, they arrived to listen to our concerns. A few days passed before we received an abundance of additional information, which only served to heighten the terror. An officer discovered that the vehicle belonged to a recently reported missing older male when he investigated the area. The entire contents of the vehicle had been pilfered, and it was further verified that the tent situated on the campground belonged to the elderly gentleman. However, they were unable to locate the two individuals, and the only tangible evidence discovered was their shoe prints. The elderly gentleman was also not located, and to the best of my knowledge, he has yet to materialize. This made both my fiancée and I queasy, as we both realized that something terrible could have occurred in an instant. Probably never will we know for certain what those two individuals were up to, but I believe we can all formulate a reasonable guess given the circumstances. Nevertheless, I am certain that the image of those two men standing before me continues to terrify my thoughts. I was fortunate enough to have a job that enabled extensive travel during my late 20 and early 30. I would typically spend no more than 2 days at a time on business trips, so my productivity was restricted when I was staying in a pleasant location. However, I had a 1-week position in Pennsylvania that concluded a day early, requiring me to remain there for an additional day prior to my flight. Since I never had much opportunity to go outside, I reasoned that I should make the most of this time and do something enjoyable. I opted for a lengthy trail that traversed several picturesque forests and trees in this area. I've always had a deep appreciation for nature, but my occupation required me to spend most of my time indoors or on airplanes, so this was a wonderful opportunity to take advantage of the pleasant weather and scenery. Despite arising early, I was compelled to visit the store in order to purchase trekking attire, since I had neglected to bring any. It took me about an hour to travel from my hotel to the trailhead, and I arrived there shortly before 12 p.m. It appeared that no one else was present, which made me quite content. According to an online resource, the trail would take approximately 6 hours to traverse both ways. Therefore, this excursion occupied the majority of the day. I began my descent with a small backpack containing a water bottle and snacks. Spending the first hour alone on a path between the trees was incredibly tranquil and provided a welcome respite from the pressures of my hectic work schedule. However, I observed a man seated on the ground alongside the path in front of me as I continued on my way. With his visage obscured by a hoodie and his head bowed, he almost appeared to be asleep. As I approached, he raised his gaze towards me, nearly directing it downward. I had no idea what to make of him as I passed him, but I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, so I continued to check behind me intermittently for the following few minutes as I descended the trail. After a couple of hours, I became somewhat weary and famished, so I sat down for a snack on a small log at the path's edge. Approximately 3 to 4 minutes had passed when the individual I had previously passed by descended the path and began to approach me. However, he was still a considerable distance away, so I decided to pack my belongings and proceed down the trail to avoid encountering him. It would appear, however, that my strategy failed. A few minutes later, I became aware of the approach of boisterous running footfall. With the expectation that he would simply pass by, I shifted to the side, but he stopped directly in front of me. I must confess that I was quite anxious and felt extremely uneasy around this individual. While remaining silent, he reached into his pocket and produced a wallet before declaring, "I believe you dropped this." Although the wallet was obviously not mine, and it was also entirely empty, he continued, "I think you dropped this." I responded that he was obviously misinformed and that I had forgotten to bring my wallet. He replied that he was certain this was my wallet and that I was required to return it. I truly had no idea what to say or do, but it was clear from the expression on his face that he was becoming enraged. I was fairly certain that this individual was attempting to swindle me or do something strange, but I had no choice but to listen to him, so I simply nodded in agreement and removed the wallet from his grasp. He then addressed me with a smile and a "You're very welcome." He then continued his descent of the trail. After a moment of reflection on the interaction that had just transpired, I extended the wallet and examined it in greater detail. It appeared to be one of those common brown folding wallets that had become quite weathered and worn out. Despite opening it and inspecting each compartment, I found not a single item inside. I simply began making my way back to my vehicle because I didn't want to run into this man again and was completely perplexed. I had no idea what to think. It was currently 4 p.m., and I still had approximately 2 hours until I could return to my vehicle. Although I made every effort to savor the stroll, my thoughts could not be diverted from the incident that transpired, and they continued to induce increasing levels of anxiety within me. I was frantically scanning my surroundings to ensure he wasn't following me, but at last, I noticed my vehicle approaching from behind. As the sun began to set, a lengthy shadow appeared over everything. Since my vehicle was situated in front of the trail, I proceeded to walk towards its forefront. When I was a few feet away, I observed the shadow of a man who appeared to be squatting behind the vehicle. I halted abruptly, fixated on their silhouette that was adjacent to my vehicle. I was cognizant of the fact that attempting to flee would almost certainly result in negative consequences, as well as the fact that he would almost certainly attempt to take my vehicle and rob me upon entering. Following a brief pause, I discreetly peered into my pocket in search of my keys before proceeding in the direction of the passenger door. I unlocked the vehicle immediately and entered via the passenger side. Immediately upon hearing the man leap to his feet and dash towards the driver's side door, I secured it from the inside just prior to his attempt to unlock it. As I retreated to my seat in the driver's seat and initiated the vehicle's engine, he commenced pounding on the window. It was indisputable that it was the identical individual from earlier, as he demanded that I return the wallet while yelling at me. I disregarded him and accelerated onto the main road in reverse, where I continued driving away in haste. As I began to disengage, he dashed back onto the path and disappeared into the trees. It appears that my strategy was successful, since his deterrence by not approaching the driver's side door allowed me sufficient time to enter and secure the vehicle. I recalled seeing a police station en route, so I deviated from my way and proceeded inside to lodge a report regarding the individual and surrender the wallet. Subsequently, I resumed my journey to the hotel. I called an acquaintance that evening to tell them about it because the situation was simply so bizarre. It is fairly evident that he intended to rob me or steal my vehicle, but I am still perplexed as to the wallet's function, as it appeared to have no particular significance. Nevertheless, I am merely relieved that I managed to escape without incident or material loss. At this time, I carry a compact pocket knife with me at all times when I go for walks. Last year, it was close to the end of October, a time of year that is typically ideal for hiking because it is neither too hot nor too chilly. I frequently went hiking with a group of friends. However, the majority of them had unpredictable work schedules, which made it difficult to coordinate excursion days. I used to frequently embark on shorter treks by myself and simply appreciate the solitude. I had the weekend off, so on Saturday morning I drove to a nearby hiking and camping trail, that I thought was quite pleasant. Having traversed this trail a few years prior, I had been eager to return ever since. It was a loop trail, which meant that it essentially followed a large circle from the beginning, and it lasted approximately 2 days. After parking my vehicle in a small gravel lot, I ascended to the trailhead. The initial few miles were relatively level and consisted primarily of verdant fields. They eventually descended into a forest situated at the base of a diminutive mountain. Approximately at this juncture of the day, I was well into the forest when I noticed a man approaching on foot. I initially could not determine whether he was walking towards or away from me because he was too far away, but as I progressed, I realized he was approaching. The last time I hiked this trail, I don't believe I saw anyone. However, it was the weekend, so I reasoned that he may have had the same notion as I did. However, as he approached, I observed that he was not carrying a backpack, which I found quite peculiar given that I was approaching 6 or 7 hours into the trail, and it seemed implausible that an individual would travel this far without even a water bottle. As soon as he made a few steps forward, he waved at me. In an effort to be courteous, I returned the wave, but I remained cautious because I was in such an isolated area. His footsteps ceased as he passed, and the soil began to disintegrate as if he had reversed direction. Upon reassessing my surroundings, I noticed that he was indeed facing me. Subsequently, he posed an odd question. "Where is your group at?" I was at a loss for an appropriate response, as all I could muse was whether this stranger was merely speculating that I was alone, or if he was aware that I typically had a group. Regardless, it was disconcerting and extremely anxious for me. I replied that they were proceeding with a few minutes lag behind me. Despite being at a loss for words, I made certain that this man did not believe I was alone. He replied, "Good," smiled, and resumed his trek. I continued further along the trail in the opposite direction. A few hours passed, and I spent the majority of that time contemplating that individual and how peculiar the entire situation was. The fact that he was so far into the hike without a rucksack added to the unsettling atmosphere. I made the decision to locate a suitable area slightly distant from the main trail in order to establish my campsites for the sake of precaution. Pitching my modest tent about a half-mile from the trail, I discovered a pleasant level area. As the sun began to set, I decided to sit outside my tent and make an effort to forget about the man. I removed and consumed the prepackaged supper that had been prepared for the journey prior to retiring to my tent in an attempt to sleep. I had been unable to fall asleep for approximately an hour when I began to hear footfall emanating from the trees situated behind my tent. While listening to their approach, I froze. Although I attempted to convince myself that it was most likely an animal's behavior, the steps were unmistakably those of a person. They appeared to be approximately 15 to 20 feet distant when they abruptly halted. It seemed like hours passed as I lay there intently listening while my heart raced, but no further footfall could be heard. It was evident that they were waiting nearby, as the footfall would have dissipated had they departed. Over time, additional hours transpired, and the sun was just beginning to emerge. I was exhausted and certain I needed to leave at some point. Therefore, I began to wonder if it was possible that I had simply failed to perceive the footfall as they disappeared. Upon unzipping the tent and momentarily raising the curtain to observe the exterior, I was unable to discern any objects. Thus, I exited the building and surveyed my surroundings. Although the trees obscured the majority of my view, and it was extremely silent, as far as I could tell, no one was present. I packed my tent with caution after a few moments, continuing to scan my surroundings with trepidation, because I was undoubtedly on alert and would be startled by even the slightest sound. I affixed my tent to my backpack and hastily returned to the trail, but each time I caught a glimpse of faint footsteps following me, my heart would plummet. At this point, I couldn't even determine whether I was merely paranoid, but I didn't want to take the chance of pausing to investigate. After what seemed like hours, I returned to my vehicle. I closed the doors after entering and took a moment to simply breathe. I drove directly back home after ensuring my safety and did not make a stop until I was back inside my apartment. That was without a doubt one of the most terrifying occurrences of my life, and I have not returned to hiking since.